Hatchet. This is chapter 6. Chapter 6 starts with another flashback, like chapter 4 did. 2 years before, he and Terry had been fooling around down near the park, where the city seemed to end for a time and the trees grew thick and came down to a small river that went through the park. It was thick there, and it seemed kind of wild, and they had been joking and making things up. They pretended that they were lost in the woods and they talked in the afternoon about what they would do. Of course, they figured that they would have all sorts of goodies, like a gun and a knife and fishing gear and matches so they could hunt and fish and have a fire. I wish you were here now, Terry, he thought, with a gun and a knife and some matches. In the park that time, they had decided that the best shelter was a lean-to, and Brian set out to make one. He would maybe cover it up with grass or leaves or sticks, he thought, and he started to go down to the lake when there was some willows he could cut down for braces. But it struck him that he ought to find a good place for a lean-to, and so he decided to look around first. He wanted to stay near the lake because he thought that the plane, even deep in the water, might show up to somebody flying over, and he didn't want to diminish any of the chance that he might have been found. His eyes fell upon the stone ridge to his left, and he thought at first that he should build his shelter against the stone, but before he decided to check out the far side of the ridge, and that was where he got lucky. Using the sun and the fact that it rose in the east and set in the west, he decided that the far side was the northern side of the ridge, and at one time it was far past it, and it had scooped up by something, probably a glacier, and the scooping had left a kind of sideways bowl back and under a ledge. It wasn't very deep, not a cave, but it was smooth and it made a perfect roof, and he could almost stand in it under the ledge. He had to hold his head slightly tipped forward at the front to keep it from hitting the top. Some of the rock that had been scooped out had also been pulverized by glacial action, turned into sand, and now made a small beach that went out to the edge of the water in front and to the right of the overhang. This was his first good luck. No, he thought, he had good luck in the landing, but it was good luck as well, luck that he needed. All they had to do was wall off part of the bowl and leave an opening in the doorway. And he would have a perfect shelter, much stronger than a lean-to and dry because the overhang made a watertight roof. He crawled back in under the dry ledge and sat. The sand was cool here in the shade, and the dry coolness felt wonderful on his face, which was already starting to blister and get especially painful on his forehead, with the blisters on top of the swelling. He was also still very weak. Just to walk around the back of the ridge and the slight climb over the top left his legs feeling like rubber. It was good and felt good to sit down for a bit under the shade of the overhang in the cool sand, and now he thought, if I just had something to eat, anything. When he had rested a bit, he went back down to the lake and drank a couple swallows of water. He wasn't all that thirsty, but he thought that the water might take the edge off his hunger. It didn't. Somehow, the cold lake water actually made it worse, sharpened it. He thought about dragging some wood to make a wall on the part of the overhang, and picked up one piece to pull up his arms. They were too weak, and he knew that it wasn't just the crash and the injury to his body and his head. It was also that he was weak because he hadn't eaten anything in so long. He would have to find something to eat. Before he did anything else, he would have to have something to eat. But what? Brian leaned against the rock and stared out at the lake. What in all of this was there to eat? He was so used to having food just be there, always just there. When he was hungry, he went to the fridge or the store, or he sat down to a meal that his mom cooked. Oh, he thought, remembering a meal now. Oh, it was the last Thanksgiving, last year. Last Thanksgiving, they had a family before his mother demanded the divorce and his father moved out the following January. Brian already knew the secret, but he didn't know that it would cause them to break up, and he thought that it might work out. The secret that his father still didn't know, but that he would try to tell him when he saw him. The meal had been turkey, and they cooked it out back on the barbecue over charcoal with the lid down tight. His father put hickory chips on the charcoal, and the smell of cooking turkey and the hickory smoke filled the yard. When his father took the lid off, smiling, the smell that came out was unbelievable. And when they sat down, the meat was wet with juice and rich, and it tasted like the smoke. He had to stop this. His mouth was full of saliva, and his stomach was twisting and growling. What was there to eat? What had he read or seen that told him about food in the wilderness? Hadn't there been something? Oh, a show, yeah, a show on television about Air Force pilots and some kind of course they took. A survival course. All right. He had the show coming into his thoughts. The pilots had to live in the desert. They put them in the desert down in Arizona or someplace, and they had to live for a week. They had to find food and water for a week. For water, they made sheets of plastic into dew-gathering devices, and for food, they ate lizards. That was it. Of course, Brian had lots of water, but there weren't too many lizards in the Canadian woods, or that he knew. One of the pilots had used a watch crystal as a magnifying glass to force the sun and start a fire so that they didn't have to eat the lizards raw. But Brian had a digital watch without a crystal, and it was broken. So that didn't really help him much. Wait, there was one thing. One of the pilots, a woman, had found some kind of beans on a bush, and she used them with her lizard to make meat and to make a little stew in a tin can that she found. Bean lizard stew. There weren't any beans here, but there must be berries. There had been berry bushes around. Sure, the woods were full of berry bushes. That's what everybody said. Well, he actually never had heard anybody say it, but he felt that it should be true. There must be berry bushes. He stood and he moved out into the sand and he looked up at the sun. It was still high. He didn't know what time it must be. At home, it would have been 2 if the sun was that high. At home, at 1 or 2, his mom would be putting away the lunch dishes and getting ready for her exercise class. No, that would have been yesterday. Today, she would have been going to see him. Today was Thursday, and she always went to see him on Thursdays. Wednesday was exercise class, and Thursday she went to see him, her boyfriend. Hot little jets of hate worked into the thoughts. Pushed once, moved back. If his mother hadn't begun to see him and forced the divorce, Brian wouldn't even be here now. He shook his head. He had to stop thinking like that. The sun was still high, and that meant that he had some time before darkness to find berries. He didn't want to be away from this. He almost thought of it as his home, his shelter, when it came to the dark. He didn't want to be anywhere in the woods when it came to be dark, and he didn't want to get lost, which was a real problem. All he knew in the world was the lake in front of him and the hill in the back of the ridge. If he lost sight of them, there was a really good chance that he would get turned around and not be able to find his way back. So he had to look for berry bushes, but keep the lake and the rock ridge in his sight at all times. He looked up to the lake shore to the north for a good distance, perhaps 200 yards. It was fairly clear. There were tall pines, kind with limbs until very close to the top, with gentle breeze sighing in them, but not too much low brush. 200 yards up there seemed to be a belt of thick, lower bush starting, and about 10 or 12 feet high that formed a wall he could not see through. It seemed to go on around the lake, thick and lustily green, but he could not be sure. If there were berries, there would be in that brush, he felt, and as long as he stayed close to the lake, so he could keep the water on his right and know where it was, he wouldn't get lost. When he was done or found berries, he thought he would just turn around so the water was on his left and walk back until he came to the ridge and his shelter. Simple. Keep it simple. I am Brian Robeson. I've been in a plane crash. I'm going to find some food. I'm going to find berries. He walked slowly, still a bit pained in his joints and weak from hunger. The trees were full of birds singing ahead of him in the sun. Some he knew, some he didn't. He saw a robin and some kind of sparrows and a flock of reddish-orange birds with thick beaks. 20 or 30 of them were standing in one of the pines. They made so much noise and flew away ahead of him when he walked under the tree. He watched them fly, their colors bright splash and solid green. And this was the way that he found the berries. The birds landed in some taller willow-type trees with wide leaves and started jumping and making noise. At first he was too far away to see what they were doing, but the color drew him in and moved toward him, keeping the lake in sight on his right. And when he got closer, he saw that they were eating berries. He could not believe it was that easy. It was as if the birds had taken him right to their berries. The slender branches went up about 20 feet, and they were heavy, drooping with clusters of bright red berries. Then they were half as big as grapes, but hung in bunches much like grapes. When Brian saw them glistening red in the sunlight, he almost yelled. His pace quickened, and he was on them in moments, scattering the birds, grabbing branches, stripping them to fill his mouth with berries. Then he almost spit 'em out. It wasn't that they were bitter, as so much they lacked any sweetness. They had a tart flavor that left his mouth dry feeling. They were like cherries that had really large pits, which made 'em hard to chew. But there was such hunger in him, such an emptiness, that he couldn't stop. He couldn't stop stripping the branches, eating the berries by the handful, grabbing them, jamming them into his mouth, and swallowing them, pits and all. He could not stop. At last his stomach was full. He still felt hungry. 2 days without food must have shrunken his stomach, but this drive of hunger was still there, thinking of the birds and how they were just going to come back into the berries when he left. He made a carrying pouch in his torn windbreaker and he kept picking. Finally, when he judged that he had close to 4 pounds in his jacket, he stopped and he went back to his camp by the ridge. Now, he thought, now I have some food and I can do something about fixing this place up. He glanced at the sun and he saw that he had some time before dark. If I only had matches, he thought, looking wishfully at the beach and the lakeside. There was driftwood everywhere, not to mention dead and dry wood all over the hill, and dead dry branches hanging from everywhere, every tree. All the firewood, no matches. How did they used to do it? He thought, rub two sticks together? He tucked the berries in the pouch, back under the overhang in the cool shade, and he found a couple of sticks. After 10 minutes of rubbing, he felt the sticks and they were almost cool to the touch. Not that, he thought, they didn't do fire that way. He threw the sticks down in disgust. So no fire, but he could still fix the shelter and make it, in his words, safer. They came into his mind, and he didn't know why. More livable? Kinda close it in, he thought. I'll just close it in a bit. He started dragging sticks up from the lake and pulling long dead branches down from the hill, never getting out of sight of the water and the ridge. With these he interlaced a wove wall across the opening of the front of the rock. It took him over 2 hours. He had to stop several times because he felt a bit weak, and once more because he felt strange, and a new twinge feeling in his stomach. It felt tight and rolling. Too many berries, he thought. Now I have a stomach ache. I ate too many berries. But it was gone soon, and he kept working until the entire front of the overhang was covered safe from a small opening to the right end, nearest the lake. The doorway was about 3 feet, and when he went in, he found himself in a room almost 15 feet long and 8 to 10 feet deep, with the rock wall sloping down at the ground. "Good," he said, nodding. "Good." Outside, the sun was going down, finally, in the initial coolness, and the mosquitoes came out and clouded on him. They were thick and terrible. If not quite as bad in the morning, he kept brushing them off his arms until he couldn't stand it, and he dumped the berries and he put his torn windbreaker on. At last the sleeves covered his arms. Wrapped in the jacket, with darkness coming down now fast, he crawled back under a rock and huddled and tried to sleep. He was really tired and still aching some, but sleep was coming, and he did not settle in until the evening got cool and it turned into night and the mosquitoes slowed down. Then at last, with his stomach turning on berries, Brian went to sleep.